All right, so let's take a little look-see at Mr. James Madison, Chapter 9, Sections 3, 4 in the book, if you want to do it that way. All right, so troubles with Native Americans. Think back to George Washington's time. Remember Native Americans between here and here didn't want Americans moving into their territory, and the British and the Spanish decided to help them out. So this is the territory we're looking at, and George Washington wants to make peace with the Native Americans. However, the United States basically doesn't listen. So what happens? They end up crushing the Native Americans at the Battle of Fallen Timbers. This leads to the Treaty of Grenville, which basically says that if we're looking at Ohio, the American people cannot move beyond this line. We can take this part of Ohio, but not here. So that's the Treaty of Grenville. Guess what happened? The American people didn't listen. During the times of James Madison, the American people moved into Ohio country. They moved into Native American territory again. So this guy, Tecumseh, doesn't like this. He and his people don't like it. And he really was very well spoken. He was really very well respected, and he pushed back against the Americans who were moving into their territory. His brother, Tenskwatawa, he was a prophet. He spoke to the Great Spirit. The Great Spirit said that, well, don't trust Americans. You can like the British, the French, the Spanish, but don't trust Americans and don't be like them. Don't use their weapons, don't use their stuff. So these two brothers really had a great alliance, and together they really got the Native American people fired up against the Americans and willing to fight them. So this guy, William Henry Harrison, was the leader, he was the governor actually of Indiana Territory right here, which is right next to Ohio. So basically, big battle ensues here, right here, Indiana Territory, called the Battle of Tippecanoe. And who wins? Well, William Henry Harrison. He has better forces. And he becomes the hero of Tippecanoe, which again makes him a war hero. And we love our war heroes. You're going to look back and realize that there are a lot of presidents who started out as war heroes because we like our war heroes and we like to bring them to the highest ranking position, apparently. So, the British sided with the Native Americans against the Americans during this time, which really fired up the United States because remember, they had been impressing our sailors and now they're helping the Native Americans to fight against us. So we are none too happy with them. So we've got these people, the War Hawks, who were basically Republicans during Madison's presidency who really pushed for war. Now, remember when Adams was president and we were on the brink of war with France, but he backed up from it? Well, we're in the same position with Britain now, except that Madison's not backing up because he's got these people, the Warhawks, pushing him forward. And they had a great sense of nationalism, loyalty to the nation. They really were go US, go US. We can't let these people push us around. We should be proud to be Americans, and we shouldn't let the British treat us this way. So the most important of these Warhawks was Henry Clay and John C. Calhoun. They were great speakers, they were well-respected politicians, and they really kept pushing for war with Britain. And by the way, yes, John C. Calhoun is a little scary looking, and yes, he has a neck beard. No hair on his face, but on his neck. It was a weird style of the time, don't ask. Anyway, where does that lead us? Leads us to the War of 1812. And the War of 1812 starts in July of 1812, although technically it goes through 1813, 1814, and a little bit of 1815, kind of. We'll get there. And here's the thing, we only have less than 7,000 men in our regular army in 1812. Remember, Madison had reduced the size of the army, reduced the size of the navy, reduced everything because he thought that government should be really small. So in order to pay down the national debt, Thomas Jefferson had reduced everything, which leaves us with only 7,000 soldiers to fight the British, who were one of the toughest fighting forces in the world at the time. So we're not in good shape, not to mention the fact that the British had made a great alliance with the Native Americans among us, that were living among us, which meant that we really weren't prepared to fight these people. We didn't have the manpower, and we really underestimated the alliance that the British had with our Native American neighbors. That remember, they had just helped to fight against us in the Battle of Tippecanoe. So, first of all, the War of 1812, there's really not a lot of stuff you need to know about it because they weren't these major turning points and they weren't these major moments necessarily in the war that are worth really focusing on. So, a couple of things you should know though. This guy, Oliver Hazard Perry, really made a name for himself. He was an admiral, young admiral obviously, who led the Americans to really defeat, surprisingly, the British in this area, the Battle of Lake Erie. Here's Lake Ontario, Lake Erie's down here. These 10 skirmishes happened in between, and surprisingly, Oliver Hazard Perry was able to defeat the British, or at least hold them off, which again is really pretty remarkable considering the fact that we had a very small navy and they had the strongest one in the world. All right, Tecumseh, remember this guy? He and his brother, the Prophet, really kind of got the Native Americans riled up against the Americans. Well, he was lost in the Battle of the Thames. So that was a pretty big loss for the Native Americans because now they lose their fearless leader. And without Tecumseh, the Prophet, his brother, really didn't have much support. So, to, the Prophet ends up kind of moving on and kind of fading into the sunset, really not really keeping the strength that he had when he had the alliance with his brother to fight back against the Americans. So that's actually a good thing for the United States, bad thing for the Native Americans. We have got frigates, which are warships. Here's an example of a warship. That's actually the USS United States. And a frigate is, again, a warship of this time that the best known of which took down these two British ships. See this ship right here fighting the British ship, the Guerriere, and this same US ship right here fighting the Java. Well, in both cases, this ship seemed invincible. They started calling her Old Ironsides because it looked like cannonballs were bouncing off of her wooden sides, which just seemed impossible. So she became legendary. In fact, you can still see her today. Her name is the USS Constitution. Her nickname is Old Ironsides, and she's still around today. She's actually over in Boston Harbor. They take her out once a year for a spin around the harbor, and other than that, she stays in the harbor. Tourists come to visit her because she, again, kind of is the stuff of legends because she was so invincible during this war. Now, here's the other thing, privateers. Again, we didn't have a big navy, so how are we going to fight the British? Well, we started using private ships. People started volunteering to let the Navy use their own ships, their merchant ships, so that we could actually fight the British. So again, this kind of speaks to the American spirit that they were willing to give up, this major piece of property, which could very well get damaged or destroyed in a fight with the British, but yet people were willing to basically donate the ship to the cause of fighting the British. Pretty big statement. Something else worth knowing is that there was a guy down here in Georgia, the Mississippi Territory, this area, who was fighting against the Creeks during this time period. Again, Native Americans and British really, really got along. They got a lot of support from Native Americans throughout. And this guy was kicking butt and taking names down in this part of the United States. And he, again, is a great military hero in the War of 1812. And guess what he's going to be? President. Because, again, we love our war heroes. And I'm going to get back to him. All right, so Washington, D.C., here's the thing. The British are coming up the Chesapeake Bay, and they recognize they've got Washington, D.C. here and Baltimore here. Which one's more strategic? Well, you'd think it'd be Washington because it's our nation's capital, but it's not. They end up going after Baltimore because Baltimore was a great port city. There was a lot more there. They had forts there. They had, it was just kind of a more important shipping location. So they did end up going up here. However, they decided that for the psychological effect, they are going to take down Washington. They want the Americans to know that their capital city burned. So on August 24th, 1814, the British march into Washington, and they burned every state building they could get their hands on, including the Capitol building, right here, and the White House. Both were burned during the War of 1812. Now, this woman, Dolly Madison, she is the First Lady. Her husband, James Madison, had actually sent word to Washington, D.C. to let everybody know to get the heck out of Dodge because the British were on their way. So they evacuated, most people evacuated the city. She wouldn't go until she saved this painting. This is one of the most valuable pieces of art in our country. It stands in the White House still today. It's important for two reasons. Number one, it's of George Washington, the best known portrait of George Washington. But in addition, it is painted by one of the best known artists from the United States. His name was Gilbert Stuart. He was a great artist of the time. And, this kind of has that double value for the fact that it's of Washington by Stuart. All right, so the Star-Spangled Banner. You know how I said the British could go this way, could go this way? Again, they went both. They went to Baltimore. And this guy, Francis Scott Key, he was a lawyer. He was watching the battle of in Baltimore. He was watching the attack on this fort off in the distance, Fort McHenry. He's on a ship, he's on a British ship actually, and he's watching and he's nervous because he is looking at this fort being attacked. He sees cannons and fire and everything all over the place, and all he's thinking is, oh my God, what is going to happen? Are they going to take us down? Is this going to be it? And he's basically looking, and then the night comes, and you can't see anything anymore. So he's waiting, 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 and when the sun comes up in the morning, what's the first thing he's looking for? The American flag, because if it's there, it meant that the Americans held off the British. If the British flag is flying, it means that the British defeated the Americans and the fort fell to the British, and that Baltimore fell to the British. So he's anxiously waiting, and when he wakes up in the morning and he looks out and he sees the American flag flying, he writes this poem called the Star-Spangled Banner. Maybe 100 years later, they actually set the poem, at least the first verse of the poem, to the tune of an Irish drinking song, strangely enough. And then decades after that, it ends up becoming the national anthem for the United States of America. So it kind of happened in a phase. He writes this poem in 1814. About a century later, it becomes a song, or at least part of it does, and decades after that, it becomes our national anthem. And here's, by the way, Fort McHenry from the sky. And here, by the way, is the flag that was flying on Fort McHenry that we ended up, we still have actually today. It's hanging in the Smithsonian Museum. So that is the official Star-Spangled Banner that the song was written about. All right, so the end of the war, well, here's Plattsburgh. The British were humiliated. We totally destroyed the British at Plattsburgh, and the British basically said, you know what, let's just be done with this thing. The war was too expensive and not necessary enough. They really weren't going to get much out of it. And they had already achieved their goals in Europe by taking down Napoleon Bonaparte in France. So they're looking at this thing and they're going, why are we spending all this money, time, and energy on this war that's going to get us really nothing? So they basically decide to end the war. So they seek peace with the United States and they signed the Treaty of Ghent in 1814. So the Treaty of Ghent ends the war. This happens in December of 1814. Remember, the war started in July of 1812. Officially, it ends in 1814 in Ghent, Belgium. That's why they call it the Treaty of Ghent. Here's Belgium. Ghent is a city in Belgium. So, here's the thing. Fast forward to January 8th, 1815, and you got this guy, Andrew Jackson. See him standing on a battlefield? Well, he's in New Orleans fighting the Battle of New Orleans. Why on earth is this guy fighting a battle after they've signed a treaty to end the war? Well, because nobody could have picked up a cell phone and called him and been like, yo, Andrew, war's over. Put the guns down, come home. Like, he had no idea. Nobody knew that the war was over down in New Orleans because it took so long to get word all the way down there. So he ends up fighting this major, like, amazing, glorious battle, and he totally whips the British, which was impressive. Necessary? No, because the war was over. But impressive, and it makes the American people kind of look at this guy and go, oh, kind of like Andrew Jackson. Because, well, again, we like our war heroes. So where does that land him a few years later? President. So here he is, Andrew Jackson, war hero, future president. So what happens as a result of the war? Again, nationalism. This is the idea that people are loyal to the nation. People were very proud to be American because we had not just beaten the British once. You know, if we beat them in the Revolutionary War, that could have been a fluke. But this wasn't a fluke. We beat them twice. No, we didn't really beat them because, again, this war was kind of a draw. We ended it, but nobody really won. We just basically both decided to stop fighting. So is it like, woo, we beat the British? No, but woo, the British didn't beat us. So, you know, it's pretty good considering how strong the British were, and they just took down the French again. So pretty impressive. So number one, Americans feel a great sense of nationalism. Now back up. Remember how the Federalists threatened to secede from the Union because they just weren't happy about the way things were going? Well, they didn't like Madison's war. They continued to threaten to secede because of Madison's war, blah, 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 blah. So as a result of the war, well, refer to number one, Americans felt a great sense of nationalism. When the Federalists were still saying, stupid war, let's secede, it made the rest of the Americans go, idiots, were you not paying attention to what just happened here? Like, we held our own against the British again. Like, what's this seceding thing? So you know what happened to the Federalist Party? Pretty much done. People weren't going to be Federalist anymore because the Federalists lost tons of support because, well, they were fighting against a war that people were proud of. The last thing is we got respect from other nations. Again, winning the Revolutionary War could have been a fluke. The fact that we held off the British twice was worthy of respect. So as a result, the American people were proud, Federalist Party lost support, and the U.S. was now respected among the other nations.